yourself to more food and drink throughout the presentations, because it needs to be eaten and drunk. So don't be shy about that, but we are going to get started with the presentations this evening. So it's my job to welcome you to this side event on rethinking scheduling and taking on the challenge of new psychoactive substances. My name's Anne Fordham. I'm the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium, and IDPC is co-organising this event with TNI, Transnational Institute, and we'd also like to thank our generous funders, the European Commission and Open Society Foundations, for making this event possible. This side event is actually part of a wider European Commission funded project that both TNI and IDPC and a number of other partners are involved in, called New Approaches in Drug Policy and Interventions. And last year we ran a similar side event as this one on the issue of cannabis. So just by way of introduction on the issue of scheduling, it's often viewed as an obscure technical issue, but the problem of scheduling actually lies at the core of the functioning of the international drug control system. Scheduling, the classification of a substance within a graded system of controls and restrictions or schedules, must take place in order that a substance may be included in the international drug control framework and determines the type and intensity of controls to be applied. For this reason, the topic is of central importance. And also, this issue has become a contemporary flashpoint for strains and tensions surrounding the general orientation of the present regime of drug control and the international conventions which reside at its heart. So, and you'll see today, the timing of this side event was not, we didn't plan it to coincide with the same day of the plenary debate on scheduling, but at this CND, the scheduling issue has been given a great deal of importance, as today, as you know, the plenary was split into two thematic debates, one on scheduling and one on the UNGAS. And it's also a pertinent issue this year in a number of the resolutions. You know, in terms of, there's a resolution on ketamine, there's also a decision, I think tomorrow, on dronabinol, which there is a move to downschedule it in the conventions. And this year, for the first time, the UK is seeking the provisional scheduling of an NPS called methadone under provisions of the 1971 convention. So it's in this context with a lot of debate going on around the issue of scheduling that IDPC and TNI decided to look into this issue. We actually have a draft paper that explores this issue in more detail, which is available here. And two of our speakers will be speaking some of the issues that are highlighted in this paper. It is still draft, and we're happy to receive comments from anyone who reads it and wishes to let us have their views. So our first speaker this evening, I'm delighted to introduce Chris Hallam. Chris is a researcher with the International Drug Policy Consortium, and Chris will speak on the situation with respect to NPS and scheduling and the potential impact this may have on the work of the WHO and the rebalancing of the system in favour of health. Chris.
Right, thanks, Sam. Thanks, Sam. I don't think this mic. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. No. I'll bring that next time.
When you're ready.
So, as Anne mentioned, the sudden proliferation of new psychoactive substances has brought the question of scheduling to the foreground. Many countries are feeling besieged. NPS, new psychoactive substances, are so fluid and dynamic, they're proving very difficult for countries to regulate. In this context, we've even had, as mentioned today in the plenary, the invocation of a tool of the conventions which hasn't been used before, the provisional controls measures, which the UK wants to invoke with respect to methadone. There is a danger that this concern and alarm about new psychoactive substances, however, could prove problematic for the rebalancing of the UN drug control system, which has been underway in the last few years, to some extent rhetorically, but fair enough beyond that too. Danilo and Ross will be talking about certain countries and regions and the response they've devised to deal with new psychoactive substances. Well, I'm going to focus on this problem of the rebalancing of the system. If countries do panic about this new issue, there's a danger that health concerns and the scientific procedures for assessment, which are written into the conventions, are going to be just sidelined. Okay, so in spite of the discourse of rebalancing the system away from criminalisation, sort of naming and shaming of drug users, and punishment, incarceration and so on. In spite of that, if we actually look at the issue of scheduling, we can see a continued process of marginalisation of the health principle, and specifically the WHO. It was interesting that in the plenary this morning there were lots of interventions from countries talking about this issue, many of them highly critical of WHO's previous decisions, scientific and public health-based decisions not to schedule substances. But WHO weren't there to respond. I'm not sure why, maybe somebody was ill or something, but it's a very unfortunate state of affairs. Okay, within the mandate given by the conventions, WHO is given the task of reviewing proposals to schedule substances. It's one of the few tasks, the core tasks in the drug control system, that actually goes to the health principle rather than the more restrictive control elements, INCB, UNODC and so on. Okay, the actual detailed work of reviewing is done by the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence. This makes a recommendation which then goes to the CND. CND can reject the recommendations from WHO, and it in fact has very broad discretion to do so. The conventions mention other factors which WHO doesn't look at. WHO's remit, of course, is to look at the public health consequences of a drug and risk assess it with that in mind, whereas the CND can look at social, administrative, economic and other factors. So this gives a very broad remit for CND to make its decision. In recent decades, WHO has been starved of funding and resources more generally. The programme on substance abuse, for example, which began in the early 90s with 6 staff, some very ambitious projects. Now 1 part-time staff member remains. And the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence itself should meet every 2 years, but hasn't had the funding recently. And has faced criticism actually for this, but it hasn't had the funding to meet. It went 6 years without meeting due to lack of funds. Its recommendations on, for example, ketamine and tramadol have been criticised by delegations and rejected at CND. And there's been a lot of pressure coming continuously from the INCB as well. I know Dave Bewley-Taylor is going to address the actions of the INCB in this regard shortly in his presentation. WHO is also hampered in its work by some of the structural incoherences that are built into the conventions. For example, the 1961 convention deals with so-called narcotic drugs. Narcotic is a medicinal term which is supposed to refer to sleep-inducing drugs, but actually includes cocaine, a stimulant, cannabis, a hallucinogen, and focuses on plant-based drugs generally. Psychotropics has basically no scientific meaning at all. It's sometimes claimed that it refers to drugs that affect the central nervous system, but such a definition would fit most of the drugs that come under the 1961 convention as well. So there's a real lack of conceptual coherence there. Under the Psychotropics Convention, there are buprenorphine, a narcotic, amphetamine, a stimulant, and LSD, a hallucinogen. And the expert committee has told us that, in its reports, that trying to decide whether to schedule stimulants and analgesics under the 1961 or 1971 convention is a major problem for it because of these incoherences in definition. Perhaps the most glaring inconsistency here is the fact that alcohol and tobacco are not classed as drugs at all by the conventions, of course. Okay, there are consequences too for the availability of essential medicines. Some of WHO's WHO-listed essential medicines are also controlled as precursors by the INCB. Many countries worried about addiction or the infraction of laws by medics are more restrictive than they need to be in their interpretation of the conventions. And this is recognised not just by WHO but the INCB as well. So the control system can be one of the causes of lack of access to essential medicines itself. And ketamine and tramadol are cases in point. And we may have problems with dronabinol as well because it's a promising medicinal substance. Okay, so a few kind of tentative conclusions for now. I think it's important that these anxieties about the proliferation of new psychoactive substances should not make us, or make governments and the CND lose sight of the importance of the health principle in the conventions, or of the value of scientific assessment of drugs. There's going to be a great need for respect for medical and scientific evidence. And the position of the ECDD needs strengthening as part of the overall rebalancing of the system, which UNODC has spoken very fulsomely about and is in favour of. The UK this morning mentioned the use of provisional controls. Under the 1961 convention, these provisional controls can be either mandatory or discretionary. Under the 71 convention, there's only discretionary controls available, and the UK has proposed using them with regard to methadone, as I said. The possible result of this could be a kind of circumventing of the conventions themselves and the assessment process of the WHO for new drugs. Like the INCB's continual calling for the domestic scheduling of various substances by countries, this could result in a de facto global ban on something like tramadol. If every country domestically bans that drug, it becomes almost like an international convention by stealth, effectively. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. That was very clear and concise and perfectly 10 minutes. So now if the rest of you could do the same, that would be wonderful. And we'll have lots of time for questions. I'm planning only to take questions at the end. I hope that's okay in the interest of time. So we're going to move on to Dave Bewley-Taylor. Dave is a professor at the University of Swansea. He also runs the Global Drug Policy Observatory, and he is also an associate with the IVPC. And Dave is going to talk about how the INCB and the CND exceed their mandates when it comes to scheduling.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. I was asked to keep the presentation as short as possible, and I could keep it very short by just saying there's a great deal of evidence currently around that suggests that the INCB greatly exceeds its mandate with regard to scheduling, and I could end there. However, I feel that it's probably better if I do go into more detail on the issue. But just to pick up on a few things that Chris said, mandates on scheduling are very clear. Under the 61 and the 71 conventions, the WHO is assigned an ambiguous responsibility for making recommendations to the CND. The INCB, like other agencies, can be invited to attend the expert committee meetings as an observer. That is where it ends. The INCB is given a mandate only in relation to the 1988 convention, and there it refers to making scheduling recommendations with regard to precursors. Now that said, in recent years, and again as has been alluded to already this evening, the board, I think, can be seen to engage in a behavioural process, something that we might want to call mission creep. So by that we mean it's exceeding or becoming perilously close to exceeding its mandate. And this behaviour is closely associated with the flip side of this mission creep but phenomena, something that we can call selective reticence. So there I mean that's a reluctance to engage in an issue area that its mandate suggests it should engage in. And so in this case, what I'm talking about is the drug controls regime's objective to ensure access to essential medicines. And here the board's generally an advocate of the restrictive rather than the enabling principles of the convention. So without being too flippant, I would suggest this is what we could call an aversion to diversion. So despite statements to the contrary, and including those made yesterday within the plenary session by the board, I think it's fair to say that the board's stance on the problem of access to essential medicines is